Your papers are useless here. The only laws that exist are our laws." The cold words rang out, cutting through the silence on the wooden porch. Thomas Beckett paused. Before him, 5 Apache women stood in a semicircle, their eyes sharp as knives, their shadows stretching out in the fading light. Thomas's hand shook as he pulled the land purchase deed from his pocket. But the paper with the red government seal now looked like a piece of scrap paper. Ahioka Greyhawk, the female leader, stood as straight as a spear. Dakota Redbird twirled the rope in her hand, ready to strike at any moment. Tyanita Ironhand stood in front of the wooden door, towering like a stone wall. Behind her, Nayeli Rivers and Chinoa Whitefeather were silent, but their eyes locked on Thomas, with no way to retreat. The desert wind blew in gusts, whipping up red dust. In that moment, Thomas understood. This was not a welcome. This is the verdict. Either submit or die tonight. If you love Westerns, stay with us. And subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. He tried to keep his voice calm, holding up the deed. "I bought this ranch legally. I paid Marcus Vance in full. This is my property." Ahioka stepped down the wooden steps, her shadow covering Thomas's face. "Marcus promised us. Live together, work together, share, belong together. He betrayed, left, then sold it to you." Thomas bit his lip, his heart pounding. "That's between Marcus and you. I have nothing to do with it." Dakota sneered, the rope in his hand lightly scraping the wooden floor. "You're involved, because you're here now. Our law doesn't die with Marcus. It lives, and you have to follow it." Thomas turned to the 4 women, looking for some concession, but Nayeli Rivers crossed her arms coldly. "You have the paper, but we have the land, the water, the crops, and the life. You think a piece of paper is enough to own it all?" Chinoa stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "We're not kicking you out. We want to keep you, but on our terms." Thomas felt his back pressed against the porch pillar, with no way to escape. Each word they spoke was like a rope wrapped around his chest. The wind blew, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the house's kitchen. Thomas caught a glimpse of the interior, the rough wooden table, the flickering oil lamp. It was no different from a courtroom. He took a deep breath. "I don't want trouble. I just want to work and live in peace." Ahioka nodded, but her eyes were as sharp as knives. "If you want peace, you must obey the law. This law is not written in ink, but in sweat, blood, and bondage." Thomas swallowed, sweat rolling down his temples. The paper in his hand trembled, as if he also realized the meaninglessness of his actions. On the wooden porch, everything became silent, except for the sound of his heartbeat. Thomas knew. From this moment on, he was no longer the owner of the land. He was the defendant in the trial of 5 Apache women, and the verdict was ready for him. Inside the cabin, the oil lamp cast a dull yellow light on the rough walls. Thomas Beckett sat down on a hard chair, his hands on his knees, his palms damp with sweat. 5 Apache women stood around, wordless, as if waiting for a ritual. Ahioka Greyhawk stepped forward and placed an old piece of paper on the table, its corners frayed. She tapped the wood with a calloused finger. "Marcus Vance signed this. He promised to work with us, to share the profits, and to share his own body. He betrayed it, and sold that obligation to you." Thomas bent down. The handwriting was crooked, the ink smudged, but still legible. Beside it was a faded seal. The words spoke of sharing land, crops, profits, and life bonds. Blood rushed to his face. He raised his head, his voice harsh. "This is a fraud. No court will recognize this kind of contract." Nayeli Rivers folded her arms, her eyes cold. "Yes, the court is 3 days away. But you are not sitting in court. You are sitting in our house. Here, distant papers are meaningless. The law of the moment decides lives." Thomas gripped the armrests of the chair, trying to keep his voice calm. "I am not Marcus. I owe you nothing." A soft laugh rang out. Dakota Redbird tilted his head, his eyes sparkling with fire. "You think Marcus sold the land? Number he sold you to us. And now you sit here, proving his words are true." Thomas wanted to argue, but Chinoa Whitefeather stepped forward, her voice as gentle as the wind through the fields. "We are not forcing you to leave. On the contrary, we want to keep you, but keep you in our way. You will have to choose, stay and obey the law, or go out there, where the desert and the bandits will swallow you up. The air was thick, heavy as if it was about to collapse on top of his head. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He looked out the window. Outside, the cornfields were green, the ditches were flowing, the cows were walking leisurely. Everything was alive, clearly created by the hands of these 5 people. A piece of land that he thought he could own with just a piece of paper turned out to be built with blood, sweat, and even his own rules. Thomas closed his eyes, swallowing his anger. Okay, I'll stay, but only to work. I didn't sign any crazy contracts. Ahyoka leaned down, her eyes like daggers. You can delay, but you can't escape. This law is not written in ink, it's written in blood. And soon, you'll understand. The oil lamp flickered, casting the shadows of the 6 people on the wall. Thomas clenched his fists, knowing that the sentence wasn't over, it had only just begun. The sky had just brightened. The desert wind blew through the wooden door, carrying the remaining cold of the night. Thomas Beckett sat by the hard bed, staring at the crumpled certificate. He felt like it was nothing more than a piece of scrap paper. He made up his mind. Taking a deep breath, he put on his coat, quietly packed up a few things, and went to the stable. The eastern sky was red. As long as he left early, he could reach town in 3 days. There was law there, someone to hear his cries for help. Thomas saddled the horse and led it to the gate. As long as he got past the wooden fence, he would be free. But as soon as his hand grasped the reins, a laugh rang out. You think you can escape that easily? From the roof of the stable, Dakota Redbird jumped down, as fast as an eagle's shadow. In her hand, she swung the rope. In the blink of an eye, the rope tightened around Thomas's wrist, pulling him back. The horse neighed, and dust flew everywhere. Thomas struggled, his eyes flashing with anger. Let me go. This is my land. Takuta held the rope tightly, his eyes blazing. This land is alive because of us. Without us, it is just dead dust. Marcus tried it, and almost died out there. Do you think you are better than him? Thomas gasped, his wrist aching. He reached for the gun at his waist, but Dakota was faster, pulling the rope, causing the gun to fall to the sand. She leaned closer, her breath hot. You have 2 choices. 1. Go out there and die of thirst, die of robbery. 2. Stay here, work, and learn our laws. There is no other choice. Footsteps echoed. Ahyoka Greyhawk and Tyanita Ironhand had appeared, silently observing. Ahyoka's gaze was stern, not needing to say anything more. Thomas swallowed. He looked out at the space in front of him, a vast desert, far away without a tree. The prospect of 3 days without water or shelter, or worse, falling into the hands of Silas Kane's bandits, flashed through his mind. Finally, he bowed his head, his voice hoarse. I will stay, but not because of your laws, because I don't want to die in vain. Takuta loosened his grip, a half smile, both mocking and satisfied. Call it whatever you want. The important thing is that you have chosen, and once you have chosen, you cannot turn your back. Thomas clenched his fists, his eyes on the ranch behind him. He knew he had just walked into a trap, but he also understood. From this moment on, his fate was tied to those 5 Apache women, whether he wanted it or not. The midday sun beat down like fire in the desert, baking the wooden roof and the dry, cracked ground. Thomas Beckett leaned on his hoe by the ditch, sweat streaming down his back. The ground here was as hard as rock, and each hoe stroke bounced back, shaking his arms. Hit harder, Tyanita Ironhand said, her voice as hard as a hammer. She stood close by, her strong arms folded, her eyes watching Thomas's every move. Every time he made a mistake and the ditch didn't flow the right way, Tyanita shook her head, her disdain clear. Thomas gritted his teeth, gathering his strength. He was used to farming, but here everything was much harsher. There was no one to help, no advanced tools, just human strength and will. Water seeped from the cracks in the ground, eventually flowing into a small stream into the cornfield. Tyanita glanced, nodded, and turned away. It was the first recognition, but it didn't come with a word of praise. Thomas sat down, his chest heaving. A figure stepped forward, handing him a gourd of cool water. Chinoa Whitefeather sat down beside him, her face gentle, her eyes as calm as a lake. "You did it," she said, her voice soft but steady. "This land needs strong hands, but not just hands. It needs a heart willing to stay." Thomas took a sip, looking at her in surprise. It was not like Ahoka with her sword-like eyes, not like Dakota with her teasing smile, and not like Tyanita with her firm dominance. Chinoa did not threaten, but her words were like soft ropes, binding tighter than iron chains. "Don't think we don't see," she continued. "You still hope to leave, but this land is no place for runaways. Once you set foot here, you either die out there or you become a part of it." Thomas was silent. He wanted to protest, but the gurgling water in the ditch, the green cornfields before him, and the salty sweat on his forehead choked his words. From a distance, Ihoka watched. Her gaze was no longer just stern, but also weighing. Was this man worthy of standing in their circle? As the sun set over the red mountains, Thomas sat silently by the ditch, his muscles aching, but something strange in his heart. He was still imprisoned, but there was something about this flow, a rhythm of labor and life that made his chest feel a little lighter. The afternoon was hot, the sunlight sweeping across the young corn. Thomas Beckett had just carried a bucket of water to the barn when the sound of horses' hooves echoed from the valley. He straightened, his heart pounding. The sound was not like a caravan. It was heavy, urgent, and dangerous. 5 Apache women stood in the yard, each holding their familiar weapons. Ahioka Greyhawk signaled for silence, her eyes on the rising red dust at the end of the road. Soon, 5 riders appeared, long cloaks, pistols slung at their sides. The leader, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, cold gray eyes, was Silas Kane, the notorious frontiersman. He did not bother to say hello. He threw a cloth bag to the ground, the sound of metal clashing loudly. 200 gold pieces, old debt to Marcus Vance. 1 month. If not paid, blood will replace gold. Thomas looked down at the cloth bag, cold sweat pouring out. He had heard Silas's reputation before. He never asked for a debt twice. The second time, there was only gunfire. "Marcus sold me the land." Thomas tried to keep his voice steady. "His debt has nothing to do with me." Silas smiled faintly, revealing yellow teeth. "You bought the land, bought the farm. Then you bought his blood debt. That's the law out here." Dakota Redbird spat on the ground, his hand on the hilt of his knife. But Ahioka raised her hand to stop him. She took half a step forward, her eyes unblinking. "Marcus is no longer here. We keep this farm." Silas narrowed his eyes, glanced at the 5 women, then stopped at Thomas. "So this is the new idiot? Easier. I'll be back in a month. If there's no gold, he and you will be lying here on the ground." He pulled on the reins, and the riders turned their horses, sending a cloud of red dust flying. The courtyard fell silent. Thomas looked at the cloth bag on the ground, hearing the metal clanking inside, like the sound of chains around his neck. Ahioka picked up the bag, placing it firmly on the table in the house. Her voice was hoarse but firm. "They don't want the gold. They want this farm. They want us gone." Thomas put his hands on the table, his eyes tense. "So what do we do? If we give it back, they'll come back for more. If we don't, they'll bring an army." Nayeli Rivers opened the map of the valley, her eyes as sharp as knives. "We can't run. We have only one choice. Turn this place into a fortress." Chinoa Whitefeather put her hand on Thomas's shoulder, her voice soft but firm. "You're here, Thomas. You're not just working now. You're fighting with us." Outside, the sun was setting behind the red mountains, and darkness was spreading like a waiting curtain. A fear rose in Thomas's heart, but also a vague determination. He knew this battle would no longer be his alone. Night fell, and the silver moonlight stretched across the valley. The quiet farmhouse resounded with the sounds of hammers, hoes, and labored breathing. No one was a farmer or a traveler anymore. Everyone had become a soldier preparing for battle. Nayeli Rivers spread out an old map on the table. She used charcoal to mark out ditches, furrows, and gaps around the fence. "This will be the pitfall. Set the wire trap here. The north gate, we'll leave it open, luring them in." Her voice was steady, sure, as if she had calculated it 100 times. Thomas Beckett leaned in, listening to every word. He had always thought of plowing the land, raising cattle. Now he learned to measure shooting distances, dig trenches, and erect stakes. Each hammer blow he pounded into the wooden post was like a commitment to stay, even if it was not his choice. But there was no way back. Tyanita Ironhand stood outside the yard, swinging her hammer, each blow sure. Sharp stakes were erected around the fence, glistening in the moonlight. Dakota Redbird was delighted to be tasked with setting the traps. She climbed quickly, tying ropes across the path. Let's see if the horse thieves can laugh when they fall into the pit. The words made Thomas shiver and feel reassured. Meanwhile, Chenoa Whitefeather gathered herbs, prepared styptics, and bandages. We'll bleed, but we'll stand, she said softly, lightening the heavy atmosphere. Ahilka Greyhawk circled around, observing every detail. When she saw Thomas fumbling with the fence, she didn't shout, just stepped forward, taking the hammer with him. Strike firmly. Don't shake your hands. Shaking hands means death. Her eyes met his, both cold and determined, and Thomas nodded involuntarily. The moon rose, the stakes were dug, the fence was raised another layer, and the whole farm was transformed into a crude but resilient fortress. Everyone sat around the fire outside, sweat beaded, hands calloused. No one spoke of fear, but their eyes shared one thing: they would fight. Thomas looked around. He no longer saw 5 women imposing their rule. He saw 5 warriors, each with her own strength and conviction. And he knew, even though he was still torn, that he was now being drawn into the circle, not just by words, but by every blow of the hammer and pickaxe he had just driven into the ground. Over the howling wind through the ravine, Ahilka whispered softly, like a promise to the night. Next time they come, they won't find a farm. They'll find a fortress. The moon had barely waned when the earth shook with the sound of horses' hooves. Red dust billowed from the valley, spreading like a tidal wave. Thomas Beckett stood guard outside the fence, clutching his pistol, when Ahilka Greyhawk's shout cut through the night. They're here. Get in position. Everyone rushed out. Nayeli Rivers climbed the makeshift watchtower, eyes glued to the darkness, gripping her rifle. Dakota Redbird strung up the rope, smirking. Tyanita Ironhand held her broad wooden staff, blocking the gate. Chenoa Whitefeather carried a basket of herbs and bandages, preparing for what was sure to come: bloodshed. The flames from the torches flared, and then the figure of Silas Kane appeared. He raised his pistol and roared, "I gave you a month. It's only 10 days today, but I've changed my mind. Your blood is worth more than gold now." The cheers rose. The bandits galloped straight into the fence. Thomas fired the first shot. The bullet hit the torchbearer in front, sending him rolling off his saddle. The whole formation was in disarray. The fence shook violently under the force of the horses. Tyanita swung her stick, knocking down a man who had just climbed over. Takata threw the rope, tying the horse's legs, sending both man and beast tumbling into the pit of spikes. Gunsmoke, screams, and the neighing of horses mixed together, turning the farm into a living nightmare. Thomas loaded his gun, sweat mixing with dust. In an instant, a dark figure rushed from the side, gun pointed straight at his chest. "Die, you fool!" The scream rang out. But at that moment, Ahilka rushed forward, pushing Thomas aside. The gunshot was deafening. The bullet grazed her shoulder, blood spraying crimson on her leather jacket. "Ahilka!" Thomas screamed, hugging her. She gritted her teeth, her face pale but her eyes still burning. "Don't stop. Stand up. Fight." Blood soaked Thomas's arm, but he gritted his teeth, stood up, raised his gun, and fired back. One fell, then another. From the tower, Nayeli fired accurately, not wasting a single shot. Dakota laughed wildly, pushing the enemy into the wire trap. Tyanita was like a living rock, blocking wave after wave. Finally, when the fire from the torches began to die down, the bandits fled, leaving behind a few horse carcasses and curses that lingered in the night. The farmyard was filled with gunpowder smoke, the smell of blood, and dust. Thomas knelt beside Ahilka, trembling as he pressed a piece of cloth against her shoulder wound. Chenoa rushed forward, her hands quick and agile, sprinkling herbs over the wound. Ahilka gripped Thomas's wrist, her voice hoarse but firm. "You see, Our law is not just a threat. It is written in blood. In this blood, Thomas looked deep into her eyes. In that moment, he knew that the path of retreat was closed. Whether he wanted it or not, he had entered their circle, and now he had to live or die with them. In the cramped wooden house, the oil lamp cast a trembling yellow streak on the wall. The desert wind whistled through the cracks in the door, carrying the lingering smell of gunpowder. On the table, Ahioka Greyhawk sat with her back to her feet, her shoulders tightly wrapped in bandages. Blood was still oozing out, staining the herbal cloth that Chenoa Whitefeather had just laid down. Thomas Beckett sat opposite, his hands clenched, still trembling from the battle. In his mind, the image of Ahioka rushing to cover him still burned brighter, more haunting than the gunshots. Takoda Redbird broke the silence. She leaned her elbows on the table, her eyes shining. There are no half-hearted ways on this front. You shot, you killed, you bled with us. Now you're either in or out. There's no room for middlemen here. Thomas bit his lip. He wanted to say he had never chosen, that it had all been a forced situation. But then he looked at Ahioka, the woman who had taken the bullet for him. In those deep black eyes, there was no pleading, only a silent demand, dare or dare not. Nayeli Rivers spread out the map, pointing to the newly drawn charcoal marks. They will come back. More. We must reinforce. But not just with wooden stakes or spike pits. We need a commitment from everyone. Tyanita Ironhand slammed her fist on the table, the wood creaking. This commitment is not written in ink. It is kept in blood and sweat. Once it is said, no one can turn their backs on it. Chenoa looked at Thomas, her voice soft but firm. You saw it today. Without us, you would be dead. But without you, we would not be able to hold this place. The truth is, we need each other. Thomas took a deep breath. His hand touched the wood, rough, cold. He could hear his heart beating, pounding like a drum. Then, slowly, he placed his hand on the table. Silence. Then one by one, Takoda, Nayeli, Tyanita, Chenoa, and finally Ahioka placed their calloused hands. 6 hands, one on top of the other, under the flickering light of the oil lamp. No need for elaborate vows. Just a short sentence. Ahoka's voice hoarse. From now on, live, work, and fight together. Together, 5 other voices echoed. Firm. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine, then warm up. He was no longer a stranger, no longer an outsider forced into a fight. In that moment, he became part of the circle, a circle bound by blood, by his own blood and theirs. The flickering flame of the oil lamp cast the shadows of the 6 people on the wooden wall. The 6 shadows merged into one, steadfast, unyielding before the approaching storm. That morning, the sun was blazing red in the valley. Nayeli Rivers climbed the high mound, crude binoculars in hand. As she looked over, her face darkened. The dust in the distance was thick, rippling like a giant snake crawling toward the farm. She hurried down. In the yard, Thomas Beckett was reinforcing the fence, but stopped when he saw Nayeli's serious face. They're back, she gasped. This time, at least 30 gunmen. The air was heavy. Takoda Redbird dropped the rope he was tying her to, half smiling but his eyes tense. Good. Do they think numbers will scare us? Tyanita Ironhand gripped her axe, her voice deep and resonant like a drum. If we charge in all at once, the fence won't hold. We need a new plan. Thomas wiped his sweat, then walked over to the map spread out on the wooden table. We can't block the whole valley, but we can lead them into the narrows. He pointed to the northern ravine, where the spikes and explosives had been hidden. If we open the gate here, they'll think they've found a way in. And when they all get in, he clenched his fists, as if breaking the air. Ahioka Greyhawk, her shoulders still bandaged, nodded slowly. Yes, this is a double-edged sword. If we miscalculate, we'll be crushed. But if we get it right, she paused, her eyes as sharp as fire. They'll be swallowed up by this valley. Chenoa Whitefeather placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. Are you willing to gamble with us? There's no turning back. Thomas looked around 5 faces, 5 different pairs of eyes, all glowing with the same determination. He sighed, then nodded vigorously. I've stepped into the circle. Now I'm going to go all the way. Outside, The wind carried the sound of horses' hooves, heavy as a countdown drum. Each hammer blow, each bag of sand added, each pit dug deeper, all like the ticks of a clock counting down to the inevitable moment. Night fell. 6 people sat by the fire. No one slept. Dakota sharpened his knife, sparks flying. Tayanita checked the axe blade one last time. Nayeli counted the remaining ammunition, so little it was heartbreaking. Chinoa whispered a prayer in the ancient Apache language. Ahioka was silent, her eyes looking out into the darkness, where the enemy's torches flickered. Thomas sat between them, his hand clasping his gun, his chest heavy. He knew, tomorrow, it would be more than just a battle. It would be the final judgment, deciding whether he truly belonged here, or just the next name swallowed up in the Arizona Valley. Night fell over the valley, heavy as a blanket soaked in gunpowder. None of the 6 had slept. They all stood in the darkness, breathing heavily and the wind howling. The sound of horses' hooves echoed in the distance, growing more and more urgent. Then the torches flared up, dozens of lights painting the mountainside red. Silas Kane rode his black horse, leading the cavalry. His voice was like a demon's. "Tonight, your blood will water this land." The band of robbers rushed forward, guns booming. The fence shook under the impact, the wood splintering. Tayanita Ironhand swung her axe, knocking down 2 of the men who had jumped over the fence. Dakota Redbird rushed forward, the rope swinging, pulling the enemy down on his back. Nayeli Rivers fired from the watchtower, each shot as precise as a knife. Chinoa Whitefeather ran across the yard, bandaging her wounds in a flash, her eyes never wavering. Thomas Beckett emptied the first magazine, the gun hot in his hand. He turned to see Ahioka Greyhawk still standing, despite her bandaged shoulder, the rifle in her hand crackling with each shot, her eyes blazing. But there were too many of them. They circled around, threw iron hooks, and climbed up from the north. Thomas realized the moment had come. He shouted, "Open the north gate. Lead them in." Tayanita pushed the wooden latch hard. The gate opened, and the bandits rushed in, shouting wildly. They did not know they were being swallowed. In the narrow passage, the spikes and explosives were ready. Thomas backed away, his hand tightening on the detonator. His heart was pounding. Every second seemed like a lifetime. When Silas and nearly 24 men were inside, he shouted, "Now, welcome." His fingers pulled hard. A thunderous explosion. Rocks flew, and red flames engulfed the narrow passage. Horses neighed madly. People screamed. Blood and dust mixed into a storm. The pressure knocked Thomas back, his ears ringing, his eyes dizzy. When the smoke cleared, the ravine was left with only ashes. The bodies of horses and men lay scattered about. The survivors ran away in panic. But Silas Kane was not yet down. He staggered to his feet, his shirt torn, his eyes bloodshot with hatred. "You son of a bitch. You're going to die with me," he roared, raising his gun and aiming it at Thomas. For a moment, Thomas thought death was coming. But Ahioka rushed forward, knocking him down. The gunshot rang out, the bullet whizzing through his hair. Thomas jumped up, his eyes bloodshot, and he raised his gun and fired back. The bullet hit Silas in the chest. He fell, his breath ragged. The farm was silent, only the wind howling and the dust flying. Thomas collapsed, his heart still beating like a drum. He looked at the 5 women around him, covered in blood, sweat, and dust, but all of them were still standing. Chinoa said softly, her voice trembling but steady, "We're alive." Thomas nodded vigorously, his trembling hand still clutching the gun. He knew the war was not over. Because before he collapsed, Silas had hissed out a name, Judge Horace Greeley. The real person behind it had not yet been revealed. That night, in the Arizona sky, the fire from the explosion still burned brightly, illuminating 6 silhouettes. 6 strangers had now formed a circle, bound not only by bloodshed, but by an unspoken promise. Together, no matter how many storms lay ahead. Dawn broke over the Arizona Valley, the first light of day sweeping over scorched fences, over bloodstains on the ground, over the lingering smell of gunpowder. The ranch looked like a battlefield now, but it still stood hard and defiant. Thomas Beckett leaned on his gun, exhausted, looking out at the devastated landscape. He had fought his way through the night, but what he saw this morning was more than ashes. It was proof that six seemingly strangers, if few, had survived together. Ahyoka Greyhawk, her shoulder bandaged in blood, stood tall. Her eyes were bright as she scanned the smoky fields. Dakota Redbird hobbled with a leg wound, but her stubborn smile did not fade. Tyanita Ironhand leaned on her axe, her arm bloody but her body a wall of steel. Nayeli Rivers carefully noted her remaining ammunition, scary and meager, but her face did not shake. Chenoa Whitefeathers sat on the porch, her hands still bandaged, her voice soft in the wind, like a long prayer. Thomas looked at each of them, a surge of emotion rising in his chest. They were no longer the 5 men who imposed their laws on him. They were warriors who had shed their blood for each other, souls who had forced him to admit this was his new family. He clenched his fists, stepped forward, and spoke slowly but firmly. From this moment on, I no longer think of myself as the owner of the land. I am a part of this place, a part of you. There was a brief silence. Then Ahyoka placed a calloused hand on his shoulder. Her voice was hoarse but firm as steel. You finally understand. This land does not choose those who walk alone. It only keeps those who know how to bind themselves to the circle. Takuta laughed, trying to hide the pain in his leg. So the law has a new clause. Beckett belongs to us. A small laugh broke through the heaviness that remained after the battle. But the joy was short-lived. At the edge of the valley, in the remaining darkness, a man in a long coat observed the scene from afar. At his feet was the body of Silas Kane, still breathing his last. The man bent down, his voice as cold as steel. You have failed. Now let me do this myself. He was Judge Horace Greeley, the corrupt judge who was behind it all. With his power and money, he did not need 30 bandits, but could bring a small army to crush any farm that dared to oppose him. In the farm, as everyone gathered around the wooden table, Thomas could clearly sense the approaching danger. He said, his voice low but firm, "We won last night, but this is only the beginning. Greeley will come, and when he does, we will need more than stakes and bullets. We need a belief." Nayeli nodded, her eyes blazing. The belief is there. 6 men, 1 circle. As long as we are together, we have a chance. Chenoa took Thomas's hand, placed it on the table, and then each of the others placed theirs. 6 hands, 6 wounds, 6 heartbeats. And above all, an unspoken oath. No matter what comes, this circle will not break. Outside, the sun was high, tearing the remaining darkness apart. Across the Arizona Valley, 6 figures stepped out of the cabin, shoulder to shoulder. They were no longer lone wanderers. They were a family born of ashes, of blood, of irrevocable choices. And somewhere on the edge of the desert, a new storm was brewing. But now Thomas Beckett was ready, no longer as a stranger, but as a son of the Apache Circle. When the dust finally settled over that battered ranch, what remained was not just a piece of land defended, but a circle of lives bound together by choice and sacrifice. A weary rancher who once clung to a deed of paper found something stronger than ink or law: the unbreakable strength of trust. 5 Apache women, who had begun as enforcers of a harsh code, discovered that loyalty could be shared, and that survival was no longer about separation, but about unity. Their story was written not on parchment, but in blood, sweat, and the stubborn courage to stand when everything else urged them to flee. For many listening now, especially those who have weathered decades of change, there may be something familiar in this tale. Perhaps you, too, have known moments when what you thought was secure slipped away, when jobs disappeared, when friendships fractured, when family ties felt fragile. And yet, like Thomas Beckett, staring into the eyes of those who once seemed like enemies, you may have found unexpected allies in the most unlikely places. The lesson of this ranch is not about weapons or battles, but about the quiet resilience born when people decide to hold the line together. It reminds us that freedom is never only the absence of chains, but the presence of belonging. A man can stand taller when he is not standing alone. A woman can carry more than her own burden when she knows another hand is there to steady her. Out on that stretch of Arizona desert, 6 strangers became a family not because they shared blood, but because they chose to share the fight. Take a moment to let that truth rest with you. Ask yourself where your own circle stands and who has stood beside you in the darker nights of your life. If this story has touched your heart, consider passing along its warmth to someone who may need it today. And if you wish, support this channel with a like, a share, or a gentle subscription. For in the end, stories only live when they are carried forward, like embers passed from one fire to the next.